Hey guys, I've just played a double Bongcloud game over the board against a fide master in a serious tournament. Let me tell you about it, and the game is crazy. So I've recently played in an over-the-board classical tournament. Well, it's semi-classical, 20 minutes plus 30 seconds per move for each player. And here in Almaty, Kazakhstan, I was playing against a bunch of strong players, and this game is crazy. So the peculiarity of this tournament is the fact that it's a training tournament, so it's not rated, and the players from one team can choose the opening, in particular 2 first moves. I don't know if the rules said that you are able to choose like first move f3, e5, g4 and queen h4 checkmate. Probably this was not allowed, but I did not ask the organizers. I chose normal openings all the time, but in one game I decided to be a little bit naughty and a little bit cheeky, and I picked the double Bongcloud. So this was the position. I showed it to my opponent. I told him, "Are you okay with this one?" He left. Everybody sitting close to us left, and we started the game. And the game is by the way, very good, very instructive. Features very instructive endgame. We both played at like 95% accuracy according to the engine. Crazy game. So let's dive into this. I will analyze it for you guys. Obviously, king e2 in this position is called the Bongcloud. It's a joke meme opening, and white is practically lost, but not because this king is in the center. Actually, white is lost because this king is obstructing the movement of the pieces. So white has to spend a lot of time moving the king back and then developing the pieces. Also, the rook has trouble entering the game because I don't have the right to castling. But when black plays king e7, it's a symmetrical position and it's very playable. It's just kind of like no castling chess. Vladimir Kramnik, former world chess champion and currently organizer of Witch Hunt, he also has pioneered the no castling chess. That is chess without castling. So the castling move is not legal. All the rest is the same. Similar to Fischer random chess, so to avoid opening theory. So we here also avoided opening theory. In fact, I briefly checked with the engine before playing this, and I saw that this is the best course of action for white. This is what happened in the game. Knight c6 targets the queen, and I drop back to e3, white to e3. I will show you why. So he develops, and I go knight c3, check, I block. Well, he thought probably that provoking f3 was good because my knight is better placed here, but I didn't see any drawback to this move. And the plan here is to go bishop d2, then to go rook e1, and then to manually castle the king. That is the plan. I briefly, as I said before the game, I checked this and I saw that white is better here. And actually, yeah, white is already significantly better because my opponent played not the best moves because he didn't know the opening theory of the double Bongcloud. So here he went for king d7. He also wanted to probably do the same, copy my piece movements. I go rook e1, and here he came up with a clever plan to go queen f6 and then to go queen d4 and trade the queens. Because apparently, if black trades the queens, black is fine. But in the middle game, I'm a little bit up in development. And if I go here, for example, king d1, and if black just does nothing like rook e8, then actually white is very much better after king c1, for example, and the king is still in the center. Black is not properly developed. White has this d5 square, nice square. Not now, because then black takes the queen, but later on. So because of that, instead of rook e8, my opponent went for queen d4, and he correctly evaluated this position when we trade as equal. And bishop b5 is an inaccuracy according to the computer. Turns out I had to go queen e2, but it's a very computerish move. So I need to avoid the trade of the queens and then harass this queen. Actually, it's very clever. So for example, like rook e8 now, I go king c1, and then I go f4 with the pawn, and then knight f3, and then this queen needs to spend some time to get away, and I have a good position. But I did not think of that. Instead, I just went bishop b5 here and allowed the trading of the queens, and turns out this position is around equal now. But okay, he goes knight e7, we develop, and he kicks my bishop, I go here, we trade, and here he starts outplaying me. He's a fide master, he has good technique in middle games and end games. And he realizes that bishop g7, this bishop is much better than my bishop. My bishop is not doing too much. And I realized I'm in trouble because he can push the pawns on the queen side, and his rooks will get active here. They will become hungry rookzillas, hungry monsters, eating everything on their way. So I was a little bit uncomfortable in this position, and I decided, okay, what do I have in this position? I have the d5 square, because my pawn on e4 controls some space, and I can put my knights on d5 and create some counterplay. So first I moved my king to c1 because I need to protect this pawn before moving the knight. And then he moves the rookzilla to b8. I go here, and he proceeds with his plan. And this is very uncomfortable. Here I spent a couple of minutes. Please remember that we have 20 minutes per game, so it's not that much. I spent 2 or 3 minutes calculating, and I decided that I should survive, but precision is required. So c3, I tried to blockade this diagonal. Turns out it's slightly inaccurate. I should have taken here first, but it's like very minor technicalities. And after a4 is also an inaccuracy. He should have done something else. He should have taken here and then gone for a4 and b4, and his knight is here on c6, ready to jump into the attack. So he didn't do that. Instead, he went a4, very logical here. And I did the right thing. I took here. So I want to deflect his knight from the queen side, which he has to do here. And now I can go king c2, and he needs 2 moves to get the knight to a5. So I'm surviving for the time being. My pawns survive. He goes b4, very strong move here. So everything is hanging here, but I cannot take on b4 because I will collapse rook b4, and these pawns will get taken, and the rookzilla will finish the job. So instead, I have to do something else. I have to take this pawn. It's the only move actually. And now black has b3, but with a check, but I can just go here, for example, and then go here, and I'm somehow surviving, even though king d3 is better, more precise. I need to control this square. And then rook a1. I probably would have gone king d3 actually. And this is equal according to the engine, because black has nothing in this position. Some pressure, yes, on the a file, but we can trade, and I can go bishop d4, a very important resource, killing this dark squared bishop of the opponent, and this is equal. So instead of b3 check, which is not that dangerous, my opponent took on a4, which is the best move. And my opponent now wants to pile up the pressure on the b file, probably somehow invade on b2, on a2. Still, it's very, very nasty. Here I, after some thought, go king b3, which is one of the only moves that is holding the position. Actually, it's the best move according to the engine. I am attacking the rook. And yes, this looks suicidal. The b file is about to open and my king is about to get hit, but his rook is hanging for the time being. He has to spend time moving it back. And now all moves lose except for one. If you go c4, for example, trying to block this b file, then there is a problem because knight c6, knight a5, and everything is collapsing. This is losing. So the only move that holds is c takes b4. This is ugly. And of course, both those pawns are very weak, but I'm temporarily up a pawn. Probably this pawn I will lose, but in the time that black takes to take this pawn, I will initiate my counterplay. That was my plan. So knight c6 is attacking this pawn 2 times, and I go knight d5, a very active square for the knight. It's serving both the purpose of defending this pawn, but also another purpose. You will see shortly what I wanted to do here. So knight a5 check. Of course, I cannot take because this pawn is pinned, so I drop back. Knight c4, I calculated all of this before going with my knight to d5, and I calculated that I have this bishop g5 resource and then bishop f6. The engine actually doesn't like this at first glance. With some precise moves, the engine finds advantage for black, but it's tricky. So c6 is the best move in the position, and my opponent does this. It's important to kick this knight away from the protection of the b4 square. But here, from afar, I saw bishop f6, a very strong move. So if he takes my knight, I'll take his bishop. Not good. If he takes my bishop, I'll take his bishop with check. And I have some counterplay, and the most important thing is the fact that this bishop will no longer hit b2. So this was a very annoying bishop before. I blocked it with bishop f6. This was like one of the most powerful pieces on the board. Now I am exchanging it. But there is one move that holds threats and retains the initiative and advantage for black, which is bishop h6. But it's very counterintuitive because this diagonal, the lone diagonal, so-called, it's very important, and it's not obvious why black should go to this empty diagonal, but this was the only chance to fight for advantage for black. Well, not the only chance, but it was the best chance. So my opponent did not see it. Instead, my opponent took an f6. I took back with a check, king e7, and now I've equalized the game practically. The engine even says that I can take this pawn, but it is suicidal. My grandmaster coach, when looking at this game, said that no one would take this pawn. it's inhuman. Instead, I make the human move. I go king c3, so I both protect this pawn and attack this knight. And if you trade the knights, I estimate this position as around equal. So here we trade the knights. And my opponent goes hunting for this b4 pawn, and I cannot hold it, but I sidestep the checks, and then I protect this pawn twice, and black is still better, but check, I drop back, and when you let the computer, the engine run on some depth, it finds some plans to press for black, but objectively it should be a draw, because rook endgames usually are a draw. And yes, these rooks, doubled rooks, are very menacing, but I have a plan to stop this annoying pressure. So he goes h5, I go rook d1. And once he protects this pawn from my rook, I go rook d3. And I'm fine with trading the rooks. Trading material when you are in a worse endgame usually is a good strategy. So he drops back, but then I go b3. And now my rook is no longer stuck defending this pawn. Now my rook can get active because this rook is defending the pawn sideways, which is much better than standing like this in the, like being tied to the pawn and having no activity whatsoever for the rook. So piece activity in endgames is paramount, is tantamount, is everything. So you should remember this from this game h4. And actually in this endgame there were 50 more moves and I didn't make a single mistake in them. I was playing, like, my grandmaster coach really praised me. He said that I was playing very precise chess. So here, rook d1. First, I activate the rook, I attack this pawn. So these rooks also are doubled now. My opponent has to do something about it. Now his rook gets more passive because it defends the pawn. I go f4, taking away some squares from my opponent. My opponent goes rook b4, trying to put pressure on these pawns, but I go rook d4. I'm fine with exchanging the rooks, again, as I said, so here we trade. He goes with the rook behind the pawn. This is very logical, and the legendary maestro of the past, Tarash, was I think the one who said that rooks belong behind the pawns, and he was right. So the plan of black is to go h3. So if I do nothing, for example, ideally go h3, and if I take, God forbid, then this rook becomes a rookzilla again and takes all the pawns. So this is not something I want to allow. Of course, instead I go rook d3, just making sure that I control this square. And after rook h5, I decide to go g4, which is a good move. Of course, black can take en passant, but it's nothing too crazy. I will trade the h-pawn, and that pawn was kind of dangerous, far advanced, so I'm fine with exchanging it for my g-pawn. Instead, my opponent tries to go sideways and take this pawn, but I have rook h3, and his pawn is vulnerable also. And here we reach a position where my rook will definitely take this pawn, but his rook will take some of my pawns, probably this or this or this. So it's a very double-edged position. He checks me first. I go here. Now he could have gone after this pawn, but then I go here, and actually this is what happened in the game. Also, he could have gone for this pawn, for example, but here I could go for here. Like there were many possibilities, but they are all drawn according to the engine already. It's 0.0. But a lot of fight remains in the game. So he attacks this pawn first. I hit him. He attacks this pawn now. Now I check him. He goes here. Now he wants to infiltrate with his king. Very instructive. The king should be active in the endgame. But I take one pawn and I take this pawn. Now he can take this one, and he does. But I go rook h6 and I want to take this one and this one and this one ideally. Obviously, he won't give me all the pawns. He pushes his pawn. I take. Now I'm up a pawn, but he has d4 check, and this pawn is very, very dangerous, and it's getting very hot. So in endgames, very important it is to activate your pieces and to push your passed pawns. This is the most important in an endgame, in a rook endgame in particular. So it's not that important that I have 2 pawns here, and this is the third one, and he has just 2 pawns, so I'm up a pawn. His pawns are more dangerous, in particular the d pawn. So I should be very precise here. So I go king c4, he checks me, I go here. Now my king is cut off. It cannot move closer to his d pawn, so he can push his d pawn, which he does. And some moves are already losing if I'm not precise. So here I decide to go rook d6. The idea is to put pressure on this side of the board. If he pushes d2, then I have g5, and his pawn cannot just simply advance. And he has some resources, it's still a draw, but maybe I'm going to start to play for a win in this position. Maybe I'll give up this rook for this pawn, but I will have those 2 pawns, and I will have this pawn if I take this one. So it's double-edged. Instead, in this position, after rook d6, putting pressure here, he decides to take my h-pawn, which is very logical. But I calculated this all. I decided I'll give up the h-pawn to take his c-pawn, because it's very annoying. It had these checks. And now I decided that it should be a draw, because he goes here, he attacks my pawn. Of course, I do not defend it. If I go rook g6, then he'll go here, and it's still a draw, but more precision will be required. Instead, I go rook d6 again. Pardon me, because I need to control this pawn. And he goes king e3, trying to wait and maybe later push. And here I go g5, a very precise move, because if I just go here, I'm losing. Rook c2 check, and then d2. And it turns out that I will have to give up the rook for this pawn later, but my pawns are not advanced enough, and the rook will be stronger than the 2 pawns. So you should be very careful here. King c3, a very natural move, loses on the spot. Also, he wants to take this with check. And for example, if I go here, he can take with check. Actually, I'll go king c3, so maybe it's not a threat, but he can go rook c2 and prepare d2. So it's also a draw, but you need to calculate. G6, rook here. Wow. So g7, king here, and then king a5. And it turns out that this will be a draw after b4. Interesting. So anyways, I decide in this position to push g5 to make him take my pawn, and then to go here. And now he has no checks, because if I go here, he has this check, and I'm losing again. So if I go here, rook c2 check, and he'll just promote this pawn, and my king is cut off. So instead of king c3, king c4 is the only move that holds the game. Now I'm putting pressure on this pawn. He has to go d2 for me not to take it. But now I go b4, and I realize that this endgame will be drawn. He goes here, and I go b5. And if he makes a queen in this position, I'll just take it, and I'll go b6, and his king is too far away to stop the pawn. He'll have to give up the rook for the pawn, or to give me a perpetual check. So instead of making a queen, he tries some more tricks. He first goes rook h5. Now he checks me, and the trick is that if I go here, he has rook h6, a very nice resource. And I'll have to take the rook, and he makes a queen. I saw this, and I didn't know if it's a draw or a lost position. Turns out the engine says it's a draw. The queen versus a rook is a winning position, but here I have this far advanced pawn. But you can easily lose this. For example, if white does nothing, for example, somehow black advances the queen, and with checks, and sometimes these positions can be very difficult to hold. In particular, like you put the queen, or for example here, then you advance your king, and if the king gets close enough, if white does nothing, for example, if white just checks me, then this is already close to losing. For example, the engine gives some crazy lines here, but let's pretend that black wants to help me. Queen c7, c8 check, then queen e8, then queen c6, and yes, this pawn will fall, because if I go here, then I will lose the rook after a series of checks like this. So this is a fork, and the rook will be lost, and the game will be lost. So this is just a sample variation that shows that these endgames are very dangerous. Queen against rook and pawn. So of course, I do not want to get into this position to play against the queen. So after this check, I do not go king c6. Instead, of course, I go king c4. I go back and I disallow this resource. So he goes here. I go with the king to help the pawn. He goes here. Now another trick. He tries to block me. For example, if I go here, he will block me like this. And he will queen next. Turns out even this is draw, by the way, because I have some checks and he doesn't have anything. But this is still a clever resource. So instead of allowing this, after rook c3, I just decide to take. And I calculate that this is a draw, and it's a draw. Next move, I'll just queen. He can check me, but I'll just run, and there are no more checks, so he takes my pawn. And there are just kings on the board, and I draw against this strong opponent. Actually, this was a very interesting tournament. I lost a bunch of games because I tried some new openings, and I scored 3.5 out of 9. But I played against like 4 FIDE masters and 5 candidate masters, and they're all strong players. So not the best tournament, but it's all right, and it was not rated, so I did not lose any rating. Hopefully, this was good preparation for the upcoming Asian Championships, where I will be playing. Check out my previous video on this channel, where I speak about that tournament. And don't forget to join my Discord server. There will be 50 promo codes for a free premium month of chess.com for the first 50 persons who join the Discord server. The link is in the description. You will find many interesting things there. I will share my insights about preparation, my games there, before you see them on the YouTube channel, also my podcast guests. So do not forget to click this Discord link, and see you in the next videos.